Hi everyone, welcome to the Alumni Community. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Julia. I'm program manager here. If you've never been here before, we have a ton of events going on here all the time, from Hebrew classes, Shabbat dinners, holiday baking classes. We have a couple great upcoming events in June. We have Kaye Scholer coming to speak as part of our Wallance series on June 11th, and on June 18th we have a Holocaust survivor who will be coming to speak as well about his experience. He's been on some of our trips to Poland and Prague, and he'll be talking about that also on June 18th. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Gregory Wallance. Gregory Wallance is a partner at the law firm Kaye Scholer, a former federal prosecutor and a longtime human rights activist. He's also the author of Papa's Game, which received a nonfiction nomination for an Edgar Allan Poe Award, and Two Men Before the Storm about the Dred Scott case, which the Boston Globe called an evocative historical novel. He has traveled to countries on several continents on human rights missions for, among others, Amnesty International and Helsinki Watch, and he was the producer of an HBO film, Sakharov, starring Jason Roberts and Glenda Jackson. He's written numerous articles and op-eds for, among other publications, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and is quoted frequently in major newspapers and appeared as a commentator on CNN, Fox News, Court TV, MSNBC, C-SPAN, the BBC, and the Today Show. Today he's here to talk about his book, America's Soul in the Balance, about the U.S. State Department and their response to the Holocaust. Thank you so much, Greg.
Julia, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, Birthright, for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book, America's Soul in the Balance, the Holocaust, FDR State Department, and the Moral Disgrace of an American Aristocracy. The American response to the Holocaust is one of the most divisive and controversial issues in American history, and I think in modern Jewish history. And generally, the approach of scholars has been in one of two categories. America abandoned the Jews in Europe, which is in fact the title of one of the most influential books, The Abandonment of the Jews, by David Wyman, versus America saved the Jews who were still alive, and there were around 2 million of them at the end of the war who would have died had Hitler not been defeated. I decided to undertake this book when a few years ago I read an account in the New York Times of the discovery of letters written by Otto Frank to friends in the United States seeking their assistance in getting a visa from the State Department for himself, his wife, and his 2 daughters. We all know how that story turned out, but after I read that account, I decided to write a book about the State Department. And the premise of my book is that while America's wartime leaders and institutions could have done more, much more, to rescue Jews in Europe, not all are equally guilty. And one group, the patrician, highly educated diplomats of the U.S. State Department, are in fact especially guilty. I think the story that I'm going to tell you is both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It's a cautionary tale about allowing a particular social group in our country to accumulate power while at the same time cutting them off from mainstream America. And it's inspiration, I think, because ultimately some dedicated young lawyers in the U.S. Treasury Department, who I will tell you about, validated the wisdom that we find in the Talmud: to save one life is as if you have saved the world. But I will begin my narrative with a spy and a train trip. On July 17th and 18th, 1942, Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful men in the Nazi government, made an inspection visit to Auschwitz. At the end of the visit, he instructed the camp commandant, Eichmann's program will continue to be carried out and will be intensified month by month. 11 days later, on July 29th, a tall, imperious German businessman who walked with a pronounced limp because of an accident when he was younger, boarded a train in Breslau, Germany. Breslau was just a few hours' drive from Auschwitz. His name was Edward Schulte. He was a senior executive in one of the German Reich's largest mining concerns, called Giesche. He worked in its Breslau office, and his position gave him access to officials at the highest levels of the Nazi Party and the Nazi military, including one who had accompanied Himmler on the inspection trip to Auschwitz just 10 days earlier. But Edward Schulte was no ordinary businessman. He was, in effect, a freelance spy against his own country. He had grasped the essential fact that had eluded virtually all of his countrymen. The Nazis were a gang of criminal thugs and brutes led by a messianic orator pathologically bent on murderous conquest and revenge. He had traveled. He had taken the same train twice before to deliver information to contacts in Switzerland, first to warn in advance to the actual date of the German invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, and the second time to warn in advance of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which took place on June 22nd, 1941. And the second time, his warnings were disregarded by the Soviet government. Now, a third time, he boarded that same train to Switzerland, destination Zurich, to deliver a terrifying message. Although we do not know how he did it, not exactly how he did it, Edward Schulte had learned why Heinrich Himmler had come to an obscure part of Poland just 10 or 11 days earlier. In Zurich, he made arrangements to meet a contact, a Jewish banker. They went to the terrace of the Hotel Bor Arlak, and there Schulte said to the banker, "I am in possession of information that sounds incredible, but is authentic. It concerns the fate of the Jews of Europe, not just some, but all of them. This information must be transmitted immediately to the leading Jewish organizations in America. Hitler's headquarters is considering a plan to kill all remaining European Jews. Unless the Allies act, there will be few Jews, if any, left in Europe by the end of the year." The banker passed the message, the terrible message, to a Jewish journalist. The Jewish journalist passed the message to the 37-year-old German-born Geneva representative of the World Jewish Congress. His name was Gerhard Riegner. After considering the incredible information, and it took him days to finally come to terms with it, Riegner drafted 2 telegrams reporting what Schulte had said. Both telegrams were addressed to Rabbi Stephen Wise, the president of the World Jewish Congress in the United States, a close personal friend and political ally of President Roosevelt, and perhaps the most politically powerful rabbi in American history. This is one of the telegrams. It's actually a Western Union cablegram. And it reports exactly what Schulte had said: Führer's headquarters plan discussed and under consideration. All Jews in countries occupied or controlled Germany will be killed, eliminated. But taking this telegram to a Swiss telegraph office was out of the question. Spies from every belligerent in World War II operated en masse in Switzerland. The Swiss, fearful, ever fearful of a German invasion would simply have refused to transmit it. So he took the first telegram to the US legation, an embassy, it's what it was called in Switzerland, but it was the US embassy, and that's what I'll refer to it as, and asked the embassy to transmit the information in the telegram to the State Department in Washington, and for the State Department to deliver it to Rabbi Wise. That took place. That is, he went to the legation on August 8th. 2 weeks went by, and Regner heard nothing. Then the US legation, his contact there, reached out for him, and someone apologetically told him that the State Department had refused to give the telegram or the information in it to Rabbi Wise or anyone else. The telegram, of course, was consistent with Hitler's own demonic writings, such as Mein Kampf, and his speeches, where he had warned that if another war started, that would be the end of the Jews in Europe. The pattern, the known pattern of deportations of European Jews to the East, the warnings of no less a figure than Winston Churchill that by the end of the war, there would be few Jews, if any, left in Europe. Without conducting an investigation, the career diplomats in the Division of European Affairs in the US State Department blocked the telegram, kept the Jewish community, among others, ignorant of what was the greatest crisis in modern Jewish history. Why? As they wrote in a memo explaining their decision not to give the telegram to Rabbi Wise, and these were career bureaucrats in the State Department, because of, quote, the fantastic nature of the allegations and the impossibility of our being of any assistance if such action were taken. Now, I'm going to suspend this narrative for a moment, for a few moments. And I'm going to focus on these diplomats, particularly the career diplomats in the US State Department. And many of them, the most influential ones in that State Department, including the ones who blocked the telegram, were part of a now all but vanished American aristocracy that at the time existed outside of the knowledge, or even certainly outside of the experience, but even the knowledge or awareness of their fellow Americans. These diplomats had grown up, had been raised in a hermetically sealed aristocratic bubble. They went from mansions with governesses to the elite Northeast boarding schools, to Ivy League educations, and then on to diplomatic postings. They were imbued with an intoxicating sense of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Many were anti-Semitic, and they were mindlessly conformist, very much a don't rock the boat mentality. The Groton School outside of Boston, and I hasten to say what I'm going to tell you about Groton bears no relationship to that school today. But the Groton School then, and particularly at the turn of the century, outside of Boston, was emblematic of the education and the mindset of these diplomats. It was founded in 1884 by wealthy men, the J.P. Morgans, the Biddles, the Harrimans, seeking an educational haven for their sons away from the cities, then starting to team with immigrant masses. The mission statement of the Groton School was the development of manly Christian character. The headmaster, Endicott Peabody, the Reverend Endicott Peabody, strode across this campus, 3 academic buildings, 3 football fields for 150 students at the turn of the century, wearing a blue suit, a white starched bow tie, highly polished black shoes, and carrying a Bible. In the evening, he led the school in prayers. And at the end of the evening, after the prayers were concluded, the students filed out one by one, shaking the Reverend Peabody's hands. "Good night, sir. Good night, my boy." Nonconformists, to return to that important theme, the theme of conformism at Groton, nonconformists, which meant wearing a cap, acting cheeky, failing to cheer at the participate in the regimented cheering at the football games, nonconformists were actually waterboarded by fellow students with the approval of the headmaster. But here's the thing. In some respects, this group is the last group that one would expect would behave inhumanely. They were given the best education that America had to offer then. They were given a strong grounding in religion with its transcendent emphasis on the eternal struggle between good and evil. And I think more than anti-Semitism, which was clearly part of it, it was their maturation within this aristocratic bubble, being cut off from the rest of America, that caused them to emerge from their educational years and their diplomatic apprenticeships with a heartless indifference to the sufferings of human beings, an inability to empathize with people from different ethnic groups, different religious backgrounds, different economic classes than their own. And I found so illustrative of this an incident that I'm going to describe. And first, in 1940, the head of the Division of European Affairs, which blocked the Regner telegram, was a man named J. Pierpont Moffat, a Groton graduate. Now, as a young diplomat, at the end of World War I, Moffat was stationed in Warsaw. After the war ended, there was still fighting between the Soviet Union and Polish armies over borders. And at one point, the diplomatic corps in Warsaw fled the city. Moffat stayed behind, but he went to the train station to see the diplomats off, and there he saw the refugees, certainly many of them Jewish, but all kinds, I'm sure, from Warsaw, desperately trying to clamber on to the train. And that night, he wrote in his diary of these refugees, "They sounded like so many cackling geese and generally behaved in a manner that made us pray like the Pharisee, 'Lord, I thank thee that I am not as other men.'" Loy Henderson, who worked in the State Department in East European Affairs, blamed international Jewry for support of the Soviet Union. William Phillips, an Undersecretary of State in the 1930s, described Atlantic City as infested with Jews. William Bullitt, an ambassador to the Soviet Union during FDR's first term, called an official in the Soviet ministry a wretched little kike. And Breckinridge Long, a wartime Assistant Secretary of State, regarded Mein Kampf as eloquent in opposition to Jewry and Jews as exponents of communism and chaos. So this heartless indifference, this pervasive anti-Semitism was an important part of the State Department's response to the Holocaust. But another important factor was that the State Department may have been the most dysfunctional wartime agency in Washington. At the highest level, Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, a former Tennessee senator from a hardscrabble mountain upbringing, loathed, fought with his Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, impeccable lineage, a descendant of the first governor of Connecticut. Edith Wharton was his aunt. He was named for Charles Sumner, who was nearly beaten to death on the floor of the Senate by an enraged congressman after Sumner gave a very provocative abolitionist speech. Grew up with a close friendship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And these two, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and Sumner Welles, fought a battle almost literally to the death, principally because Welles acted as though he were the Secretary of State when there was, of course, a very much alive and active Secretary of State in the immediate vicinity. But what's fascinating is neither was inhumane. Sumner Welles was the one official who tried to do something, as I'll show you, about the terrible events in Europe, and after the war became a committed Zionist. Cordell Hull was actually married to a woman of Jewish descent, although he never talked about that fact in public. But their feud left a vacuum in the State Department on Jewish refugee and rescue affairs, into which these careerists, these unsympathetic, callous diplomats stepped and actually, as a result, controlled much of American policy for an important period of time towards Jews in Europe. And to pick up our narrative, to go back to the story, Schulte's message did reach American Jews, but no thanks to the State Department. I said there were 2 telegrams. He took the second telegram to the British Embassy in Switzerland and asked them to transmit the telegram to a Jewish member of Parliament named Sidney Silverman. The British Foreign Office hesitated, but concluded it could not withhold a telegram of this nature from a Jewish MP. So Silverman got the telegram. He then conveyed it to Rabbi Stephen Wise in the United States. Wise then reported the contents of the telegram to Sumner Welles, who he regarded as sympathetic to the plight of Jewry in Europe, and asked him to investigate. Welles instructed the American diplomats in Switzerland, who had just weeks before been told that the telegram was being put, in effect, in a wastebasket. They then get a cable from Welles telling them, investigate this, reach out for Regner, find out if there's any corroboration. That takes place over the next few weeks. And Regner did provide corroboration, and the diplomats, the American diplomats in Switzerland, spoke to, among others, a high official of the International Red Cross with contacts in Berlin. November 23rd, 1942, the legation sends a cable, a report this thick, to the State Department, a dossier on all of the information that corroborates Gerhard Regner. As soon as Sumner Welles receives this cable and reads it, he summons Rabbi Wise. Rabbi Wise appears in Sumner Welles's office the next day. When he enters the office, he sees on Sumner Welles's desk diplomatic cables from the diplomats, the American diplomats in Switzerland, with bright red seals. And as Stephen Wise wrote in his memoirs many years later, to him, they were his people's blood pouring forth in rivers. And Sumner Welles spoke movingly to Wise, suitably for the occasion. I hold in my hands documents which have come to me from our embassy in Bern. I regret to tell you, Dr. Wise, that these confirm and justify your deepest fears. That evening, Rabbi Wise held a press conference and launched a publicity campaign that included a national day of mourning and prayer. But the Division of European Affairs told journalists, congressmen, that the reports that Rabbi Wise was making were unconfirmed. In effect, they attempted to discredit Wise. On December 8th, 1942, a year and a day since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Rabbi Wise and 4 other leaders, the Jewish American community, met with Roosevelt, discussed the information that they had obtained. Roosevelt promised to issue a war crimes declaration. The State Department objected. They wrote, the various governments of the United Nations would expose themselves to increased pressure from all sides to do something more specific to aid these people. The declaration was nonetheless released in mid-December 1942 by both the American and British governments, and it confirmed that a continent-wide extermination of the Jews of Europe was underway and vowed war crimes prosecutions when the war was over against responsible German officials. But in the meanwhile, Eichmann's program had indeed been intensified. And Gerhard Regner and other Jewish organizations in Switzerland put together another cable. This cable reported that 6,000 Jews were being killed daily in Poland. It also reported that in Romania, some 130,000 Jews had been deported to a horrible place in the Ukraine called Transnistria, now occupied by Germany and Romania, and already 60,000 had died and the other 70,000 were starving. Now, that cable reached the State Department. The State Department hesitated, and this time decided to give it to Jewish American groups, including Rabbi Wise, partly, I think, because they thought it was too risky to withhold it, given that the information was out. And the release of the cable, in fact, coincided with plans by Jewish groups to hold consecutive mass rallies in Madison Square Garden to demand that the US government do more to rescue Jews in Europe. And fearful of pressure to rescue Jews, fearful of the pressure that was being generated by these cables, the State Department then sent back to its diplomats in Switzerland another cable. And this cable, sent just about a week after they received the first one. It's a very subtly drafted, very subdued cable. It simply says, in the future, referring where it says January 21 to the one that reported 6,000 Jews are dying each day, it simply says, we suggest you, the diplomats in Switzerland, do not accept reports submitted to you to be transmitted to private persons in the United States. In effect, the State Department was shutting down the one conduit available to Jewish groups operating in Europe to get information about the greatest murder in the history of civilization to Allied governments. Looked at another way, you could say the State Department was trying to cover up what becomes known as the Holocaust. Now, Cable 482, the earlier one, that reported on horrific events, discussed the Jews who were deported to Romania. And they were sent from the eastern provinces of Romania, which is here, Bukovina and Bessarabia, to, as I said, this place called Transnistria in the in the German-occupied Ukraine, and that's this area. And there they were dispersed among almost 100, call them ghettos, call them camps, and basically left there to die. Jews were pulled from their homes and forced to march into Transnistria. One was an 11-year-old girl named Ruth Glassberg. Day after day, 18 miles a day, often in deep mud, Ruth, her parents, and her brother walked a road lined by those who had perished from exhaustion, lined by those, the dead who had perished from exhaustion, who had been shot. And again, I'm going to suspend the narrative, and I just want to describe what she endured. In the rear room of a partly destroyed house with a leaking roof, no doors, windows, heat, or running water, 11-year-old Ruth sat on the cold dirt floor. She had watched as just a few steps away, first her father and then her older brother succumbed to the cold, disease, starvation, and exhaustion. Outside it was snowing. She heard the sinister clanging bells of the undertaker's sleigh piled high with bodies gliding to a stop. But the clanging bells triggered Ruth's imagination, protective imagination, and she was now a child again, enjoying the simplest of pleasures in her mind, a sleigh ride. In her hometown, a Romanian city at the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, horse-drawn sleighs provided transportation in the winter. But her imagination could shield her only for so long. And soon she was back in the place called Bershad, in the hellish land of Transnistria, the nightmare that was her existence, watching her mother die. Ruthika, her mother said in a weak voice. "You are the only one who will survive. People are kind and will take care of you. Be good, obedient, and well-behaved, and everything will be fine. Please don't leave me alone." She shook her head and only murmured, Ruth dreamed of her grandfather's farm, where she planted onion and radish seeds in the little vegetable garden. She watched them grow each day, life springing forth from the soil. It rained, and she stood face up, feeling the cool, fresh raindrops splash on her face, and then she ran through the puddles in her bare feet. But then her protective imagination could only hold up for so long. She was back in the hovel, where she put a hand to her mother's face. It was ice cold. Her reality now was a child's worst nightmare, worse even because Ruth had not just lost her family. She was an orphan in a land of death. Crying, clinging to her mother's body, Ruth screamed at her, "How could you leave me in this crazy place?" She is left in the care of two sisters from her hometown who live in a room in another house. The sisters steal her few possessions to barter for food. Every now and then they give Ruth a piece of potato to eat. Each day, Ruth visits her dead mother. Standing on tiptoes, she stares at her mother's corpse through the hole in the wall that used to be a window. Each day, her mother's body is in a different place in the room. She couldn't quite get her mind around it, and she asked the sisters, and they explained that hungry dogs often fed on the corpses. Ruth chased after the gravedigger's sleigh, which now makes 50 fully loaded trips to the cemetery, begging the driver to take her mother. Finally, on the day of her 14th visit, her mother's corpse was gone. Tears frozen to her face, Ruth walked back to the sisters' room. She remembered her dead mother's words. "Ruthika, you are the only one who will survive." And with a sudden insight, Ruth realized it was not a prophecy. It was her mother's command. And now she had to fulfill it. She had a reason to live. And it was not long after this that a genuine opportunity arose to rescue the Transnistrian Jews. On February 16th, 1943, 2 weeks after the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, a devastating defeat for Nazi Germany, an article appears in the New York Times. It reports that the Romanian government, which lost 160,000 soldiers at Stalingrad, had offered to let the surviving Jews in Transnistria emigrate to Palestine. The Romanian government was seeking to ease what might otherwise be harsh peace terms, doubting at the very least now that Germany might win the war. But they demanded $50 a Jew for transportation costs. The proposal was a serious one. It was even endorsed by the Catholic Bishop of Bucharest, who would permit use of the Vatican flag on ships transporting the Transnistrian Jews. It took more weeks, but Gerhard Riegner in Switzerland put together a rescue plan, and he managed to get word to Stephen Wise that he had important news. Wise again contacted Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles and asked him to ask the Swiss mission, the U.S. mission and the U.S. Embassy in Switzerland to reach out for Riegner and find out what was his information. That broke the embargo on the transmittal of Holocaust-related information via the U.S. Embassy in Switzerland. And in fact, Riegner did provide a detailed account of the rescue plan that was transmitted to Stephen Wise. But the rescue plan did not move forward in the State Department. In fact, there was a Jewish official who fought for the rescue plan, one of the few Jews in the State Department at the time, and he was told by his superiors to stop making proposals as to the proper means of dealing with refugee evacuations. He was so angry that he resigned and joined the US Army. So in July of 1943, Stephen Wise takes the rescue proposal directly to Roosevelt. He explains the proposal, and he further explains that because money would be involved, transfers of money to an ally of Nazi Germany, the approval of the US Treasury Department, in fact, a license would have to be issued by the US Treasury Department approving such a transaction. "Stephen, why don't you go ahead and do it?" said Roosevelt without hesitation. "Mr. President, I have not even felt free to broach this with Treasury Secretary Morgenthau until after I had consulted with you." On the spot, Roosevelt picked up the phone and called Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury. "Henry, this is a very fair proposal that Stephen makes about ransoming Jews." Immediately, the Treasury Department provided the necessary authorization for the financial parts of the transactions. But despite presidential approval, despite Treasury Department approval, the State Department refused to transmit the license to its embassy in Switzerland to give to Gerhard Riegner. As one of the Foreign Service officers involved told the Treasury Department lawyers, he wrote, "It would probably be impossible to work out satisfactory arrangements with the Romanian authorities. German consent would not be forthcoming. Under the British White Paper, only about 30,000 Jews can be admitted to Palestine, and there are no other areas to which the remaining Jews could be evacuated." In one of this story's most remarkable twists, this rescue plan suffered another blow when Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, the one sympathetic high-level official in the State Department, was forced to resign. But it was not because of his support for European Jews. 3 years earlier, it's the fall of 1940, there's a presidential train on the way to Alabama for the funeral of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, attended by 60,000 people. On the way back to Washington, Welles's sleeping car, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, was sick and couldn't go. Welles's sleeping car was next to the president's. Welles drank late in the dining car that night. Welles had a history of bisexual activity. When he returned to his sleeping car at 4 in the morning, he summoned a Pullman porter. And in those days, Pullman porters were all black men. And Welles propositioned the first porter to appear in his compartment to engage in paid sex. The porter politely declined, but reported the incident to railway officials who told the Secret Service. The head of the Secret Service detachment sent a pot of coffee into Welles's compartment and stationed an agent outside his door. The rest of the trip passed uneventfully. But almost as soon as the train reached Washington Station, Union Station in Washington, rumors were flying. Welles managed to hold on to his job for another 3 years, possibly because no one could believe that a senior government official, not least of all the patrician Undersecretary of State, if he was in his right mind, would solicit Pullman porters on a train carrying the president, the entire cabinet, the Secret Service, and railway officials. But eventually, Cordell Hull got his hands on the information. And he took his time, but he used it to bring down Sumner Welles. He went to Roosevelt, and he gave Roosevelt an ultimatum: either Welles would go or he would. And Welles, in August of 1943, just when the Romanian rescue proposal needed his support the most, resigned. So, Roosevelt had approved the rescue plan. The Treasury lawyers, the Treasury Department had approved it. The State Department refused to transmit the license, and now it's the middle of November 1943. And it's still, the license still has not been transmitted to Gerhard Riegner. And here's the redeeming part of this story, this tragic, tragic story. This license had the support of 4 lawyers in the US Treasury Department. They were all Christians. They were all idealists. They were drawn to the Treasury Department because it was a New Deal agency. They were motivated to defeat Germany. They were hired on the basis of that motivation. They had helped to keep Britain and the Soviet Union fighting through the Lend-Lease program, which they were involved in developing. One had narrowly escaped German bombs while on an overseas mission. They were tough, bureaucratic infighters, and they were not used to failure. Their names were Randolph Paul, John Peel, Josiah Dubois Jr., and Ansel Luxford. But initially, the Jewish Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, was hesitant to act for fear of triggering an attack on himself and FDR because he was Jewish. And this was at a time when anti-Semitism peaked in America. There were over 100 overtly anti-Semitic organizations operating in the United States. Every week, Father Coughlin told 3 million listeners that the New Deal was really a Jew deal. And Morgenthau, and this is one of the most compelling dramas within this drama, was Morgenthau's relationship with Roosevelt. He was both insecure and loyal to Roosevelt. He wrote after he left office that FDR never let anyone around him, including his cabinet, have complete assurance that they would still have the job the next morning. And the Treasury lawyers urged him to take the issue, confront the State Department over this issue, or at the very least, take it to Roosevelt. And in an extraordinary outburst, in front of his staff, with the pressure from these Treasury, his own staff, knowing that Jews are dying in Romania and Transnistria, fearful of jeopardizing his most important relationship, Morgenthau has an outburst. Let's call a spade a spade. I am Secretary of the Treasury for 135 million people, see? And he's talking to his staff. That is the way I think of myself. I represent all of them. But if Mr. Hamilton Fish, Republican congressman, was to go after me, he goes after me because I am a Jew. Let's use plain, simple language. He doesn't go after me because I am secretary. He goes after me because he thinks I have done something for the Jews because I'm a Jew. But these lawyers did not give up. I'm a former federal prosecutor, and I recognized in how they followed up, even with their boss resisting, first-rate investigative talent. They tracked down and they interviewed the Jewish official who had resigned in anger from the State Department. They got hold of documents within the State Department and finally got hold of the 2 cables that I showed you earlier, including the one that in effect shut down reports from Europe on the Holocaust. And on December 18th, 1943, one of these lawyers went to the State Department, and there he was shown the cables. He took copious notes. He knew he had a smoking gun. And now events start to move quickly. Between the middle of December and the beginning of January 1944, the Treasury lawyers prepare 3 extraordinary documents. The first, which they give to Morgenthau, the first accuses the State Department officials of being accomplices of Hitler and war criminals. The second states that unless Jewish rescue was taken away from the State Department, no action would be, quote, taken to prevent the complete extermination of the Jews in German-controlled Europe, and this government will have to share for all time the responsibility for this extermination. And the third said that there were a growing number of people who see plain anti-Semitism as motivating the State Department. One of them told Morgenthau that if he did not go to Roosevelt, he was going to resign and hold a press conference. And finally, Morgenthau decided to act. On January 16th, he and two of these lawyers met with Roosevelt at the White House. It was a Sunday. They presented him with the evidence, including the two cables. "Mr. President," said Morgenthau, "the Treasury Department has uncovered evidence that the people in the State Department were not only inefficient, but they were actually taking action to prevent the rescue of the Jews." 6 days later, the White House announced the creation of the War Refugee Board, which took Jewish refugee and rescue issues away from the State Department. The War Refugee Board is credited with saving 200,000 Jewish lives. One of its emissaries was Count Raoul Wallenberg, who saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews, probably at the cost of his own life. And another, improbably enough, another emissary of the War Refugee Board was the vice president of Bloomingdale's department store. His name was Ira Hirschman, and he was appointed the war refugees emissary to Turkey. He traveled to Turkey in March of 1944. And by now, a license has been issued to Gerhard Riegner in Switzerland. But the War Refugee Board and Ira Hirschman have a different idea in mind. Hirschman meets at the home of a Red Cross official in Ankara, and present is a Romanian diplomat. Hirschman is very blunt. "Minister, you and your family are going to be killed by the Russians. But I have an offer for you. I will get you a visa, and a visa for every member of your family, in exchange for one simple act which will cost you nothing." "And what is that?" asked the minister. "Open the doors of the camps in Transnistria. These are your citizens, but if you don't want them, we will take them. It is not impossible." They meet 2 weeks later. And the deal was accepted by the Romanian minister. Soon 5 ships are carrying thousands of newly created orphans to Palestine. Ruth Glassberg was repatriated to Romania. She survived. And today she lives in Miami. And all told, some 40 to 50,000 surviving Transnistrian Jews were rescued by the War Refugee Board. At the end of their last meeting, before they parted, the Romanian minister asked Ira Hirschman a question. In his memoir, Hirschman wrote that the question caused him to vow never to hesitate to act in a matter of humanitarian mercy. If this means so much to you in the United States, why didn't you come sooner? You could have saved more lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As now we can have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm actually going to start. I had mentioned in your bio that you've been a human rights activist for a long time, and I was just wondering if you could talk to everyone here a little bit about your experience and the kind of things you've worked on.
Not long after I got out of law school, I went to work for Amnesty International. This is the late 1970s. And it was very interested in the human rights movement because it was then just becoming part of the public consciousness. And they asked me to go on a trip to, it's now known as Namibia, to monitor a political trial. And after that, I traveled to the Soviet Union. This was in 1979, and it was a double mission. I was representing Jewish refuseniks, Jews who had demanded the right to emigrate to Israel, but instead were incarcerated or sent to Siberia, and actually presented the petitions to Soviet authorities, as well as meeting with a number of dissidents. Those are the ones who did not want to leave, but they wanted to change the Soviet Union, including Andrei Sakharov, the great nuclear physicist and humanitarian who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. And it was an outgrowth of that trip that I was involved in producing a movie, one of the first HBO movies, HBO-made movies, about Sakharov, that was instrumental in keeping him from a terrible fate in Russia, because it became a worldwide phenomenon just as he was on a hunger strike, and it caused the Soviet Union. His hunger strike is what did it, but it helped to reinforce what he was trying to do, and the Soviet Union backed down on his demands, which is extraordinary given what the Soviet Union was like then. And since then, I've been to Czechoslovakia, British Guiana, Grenada, the West Bank, Peru. I've done reports on Cuba and other countries, although without visiting them. And I was drawn to this material partly because this was the first intragovernmental battle over human rights, over humanitarian intervention in the United States. All the others, in a way, Bosnia, Rwanda, Cambodia, they all have the genesis or ancestry in what happened in the story.
I want to go back to some of the things you were saying. Do you think with today, the fact that, to get information, you don't need just to sneak a telegram out, that if we were in a situation where information was able to flow back then, as opposed to having to sneak telegrams, do you think the American response would have been different if the public at large had known what was going on? Or do you think the State Department would have still been able to stop the rescue or to delay?
I think if somehow pictures could have gotten out of what was taking place, I think the American response would have been different. And I'll illustrate it with a story I told you earlier. When the American Army liberated concentration camps, Eisenhower, the commander-in-chief, and General George Patton, who's a well-known figure, made a visit. Patton, who was legendary for being a tough guy, could not make it past the gate. He was overcome by what he saw just as he entered this camp. Eisenhower saw the camp, and afterwards he ordered American units in the area to make the same visit. He said, "They may not know what they're fighting for, but they will goddamn well know what they're fighting against after they see this." And there's an episode, and we were talking about that earlier, in Band of Brothers, if you've seen that HBO miniseries called Why We Fight, which was about a unit of the Army that liberated a fairly small camp, and how it dawned on them, because to these guys, these soldiers, this was just a dirty war they wanted to get over with. They didn't see what they were doing in any big perspective. They knew they were fighting because there was an enemy of the United States, but it was just an endless horror for them, and they wanted it over with. But when these guys saw these camps, they said to each other, "Now I know why I'm fighting, why we fight." And I think it would have had an impact on the American people. But just to elaborate, in all those other incidents of genocide that I described, while there was a great deal of attention devoted, and there were graphic images in many of the cases, the United States did not put soldiers in harm's way. And we can discuss the reasons, and there are good reasons for it. I think ultimately I don't think the American people would have supported it. And in some cases they did some good in Bosnia, and others not so much good. It's hard to really appreciate what this country was like during World War II. But starting on December 7th, the United States of America reorganized itself at every level for only one purpose. And that purpose was to smash Nazi Germany and its allies. The soldiers went there. They were fighting to remove a mortal threat to the United States. No question. They didn't go there to save Jews. But there's also no question that their sacrifice, the 400,000 dead American soldiers, and the effort of the entire country, defeated Germany and saved the lives of somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million Jews in Europe who would have otherwise undoubtedly perished had Germany not been defeated. And I'll tell a story that kind of crystallizes this for me. And it comes up more in the debate about Roosevelt and what he did. But after the invasion, or immediately following the invasion of the Soviet Union, they were not regular army units. They were called Einsatzgruppen. They were mobile killing forces, were sent behind the invading German army to kill any Jew they can get their hands on. It was a mobile Auschwitz. They killed 500,000 Jews in just a matter of weeks. Now, by 1942, 1943, there's a huge battle raging in North Africa between the British forces and German forces. And there was an Einsatzgruppen unit in Greece waiting for the fall of Cairo. And if Cairo had fallen, they were going to go into the Middle East and they were going to kill every Jew in North Africa and every Jew in Palestine. And there's no doubt in my mind that not only would they have killed every Jew in the Yishuv, but they would have dynamited every evidence that the Jewish people had ever existed there. And the reason there was a British army in North Africa was in no small part due to Roosevelt and Lend-Lease and the support, the critical support, that the United States gave Britain when it was the only country fighting Nazi Germany and had its back to the wall. So the story I tell is an important story, and it's a disturbing story. But I don't think it's a story that should leave people ashamed of this country's role in World War II as regards the Jews. It's a balance. I think Elie Wiesel said, as thankful as we are of the United States' contribution in the war, as embarrassed as we are over what it did during the Holocaust, I agree with him to a point, but I think really we can be a little more proud and a little more embarrassed without absolving the State Department, people in the government, even Roosevelt, who could have spoken out more on this topic had he wanted to, and at least made a moral statement. And that, above all for me, is what is missing in terms of assessing his conduct, was a moral statement, using his great powers of communication to explain to the American people that they were fighting a monstrous evil unlike anything that had ever appeared on the face of the earth. And that was something that had to be seen through, no matter what the cost.
You discussed the sort of upbringing of these career diplomats or the primary actors in the State Department and how they sort of had this privileged aristocracy that led to a disconnect with minorities or people of different religions or less privileged than them. But just putting that aside then, I mean, when we get to...
Did everybody hear the question? The question was, even after the United States is now fighting and has soldiers, not in Europe at that point during this period, but soldiers going to war, heading for the fronts and all that, why did the State Department persist? again, I think it's not a simple answer. It's not anti-Semitism, even though for many people that's the self-evident truism. It's not. It's not just that. It was this mentality, this conformism, this lack of imagination, but this lack of empathy, and they came up with rationales that are almost gruesome to think about. And the rationale was, well, where are we going to put these Jews, even if we rescue them? We can't send them to Palestine because the British won't allow that many in. We can't bring them back to the United States because there'll be an uproar on the part of conservatives. So where are we going to put them? We'll end up being embarrassed by Hitler. Some were actually concerned that Hitler would say, well, here, you want them, you can have them. Just send your ships and take them away. And then they would be put in an impossible position. I can only say to that if your moral outlook can accommodate that kind of rationale, then there's something wrong with it. And at the same token, the moral outlook that says there's something terribly wrong is not something that's the product of a rational process. It's the product of just listening to this. It's the product of reacting to it. And these guys in the State Department just didn't have that capability. The Treasury Department lawyers, and again, they're all Christians, they internalized instantly what was happening. And they couldn't get over it. They couldn't believe that these rationales were being put forward. And they said, look, if we took these people, those who could be rescued, and we put them in prisons in the United States, it would be more humane than leaving them to die. And they really believed that what the State Department was doing was aiding Hitler. And in effect, they said, we're no different. They were writing these memos saying, we're not, and these were loyal, patriotic Americans, and they were saying, we're no different. If we're going to allow this to happen, this puts us just in the same boat as Hitler. And it's their ability to see what was so dreadfully wrong that is the one saving grace in this whole episode. And in some ways, I think they were perhaps far ahead of their times. I'm not certain. Today, I think this would not happen. I don't think you will see the reappearance of this particular group of people. I think the risks that we face are the increasing segmentation of American society, where they're very important, powerful, wealthy members of our country who are not exposed to other groups, maybe on the way to the first-class lounge in an airport. And I think there's something disturbing about having important elements of the country cut off from one another. I think it's been referred to as the skyboxification of American life. In the old days, and this is decades ago, the cost of going to a ball game, it was $2 for the bleachers, $5 for the seats near the field, and everybody sat together. Well, now it's, the $60,000 for the skyboxes, and people aren't sitting together. And we can lose our cohesiveness as a country, the sense of we're all in this together, if we don't understand one another. And this group just could not identify with what was happening, and this mindless conformism, this don't rock the boat, don't disturb things, was a critical factor. But maybe a psychiatrist could also help a little bit. You had a question.
Yeah. Could Roosevelt have used his powers of executive order to stop the State Department from, blocking this information, and if so, why didn't he?
Well, he used it was an executive order that set up the War Refugee Board, and had he done that a year earlier, who knows how many lives would be saved. It's a very good question, though. Why didn't he? And that's what the debate is about. And I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer. The critics say he was just callous. This great symbol of American humanitarianism was callous and uncaring. Others say he was consumed with the war. He single-mindedly focused on the war, didn't fully appreciate the implications. And again, he might have said to someone, I'm trying to destroy Hitler. How many more B-24s can I manufacture? I've got 10 million men and women in uniform. 5 million of them are overseas. How many more can I put in uniform? We've exhausted our supply. I think here's where I come out. I think somehow he's probably one of our greatest presidents. He, for all his vision, he understood the threat the Nazis presented better in the 1930s, better than any leader in Europe than Winston Churchill. But he missed the moral significance. Lincoln, by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, really by the time of the Gettysburg Address, didn't miss it. He understood it was more than just a war for national survival. He understood something more important, more eternal, was taking place, was transforming the country. And to a largely racist population, he gave the Gettysburg Address, and then quite explicitly in the second inaugural said, we are fighting this war, we are shedding this blood because of slavery, and we are going to keep on doing that until slavery is gone. And that's why I think he has left an indelible moral mark on American history, on all of us, really. But Roosevelt, for all his great crisis management, and it's extraordinary, 2 of the 3 great existential crises since the founding of the country took place on his watch. The Civil War was Lincoln, the Depression, and World War II. And he managed them brilliantly. But somehow he couldn't see the moral implications, and that, unfortunately, for those who admire what he achieved, it's a disturbing fact.
Do you think there's a connection between their position on saving the State Department's, I guess, being against saving Jews in World War II and their opposition towards the creation of Israel?
Yes, I think some of those same...
I was going to say that, like, a lot of these people were descendants of Christian missionaries that were totally against the creation of Israel, or creating Yeshua, creating, rocking the boat over there.
The question was whether the mentality, the personnel of the State Department during World War II was a reason why the State Department opposed recognizing Israel in 1948. And you mentioned that Christian missionaries at that time anyway, were more hostile to the concept that Israel was premised on, I think.
Well, like, a lot of the diplomats were actually children descended from, like, the Christian missionary community. Like, they had been working to build up the community there, and they saw it.
I answer that with a caution. I didn't get into the post-war era, but I do know that many of the same diplomats were in charge, who were involved in 1944, were responsible for the Middle East division. And they were very much, during the war, Arabists. And they fought efforts to set up refugee camps in liberated North Africa because they were concerned it would rile the Muslim population. And I think they were also Arabists when it came to setting up, to recognizing Israel.
From what I understand, Roosevelt seems a good deal culpable for all the actions that ensued in Germany, starting from the early 1930s. Right? All the Nuremberg laws, all this, he presided over a government quite anti-Semitic. And I'm sure he had other avenues of information feed other than Secretary Hall. And in 1939, the U.S. turns away to St. Louis. And how hard would it be to dock the ship, find out what's going on, for a few weeks, you know? And absent Japan's attack on Hawaii, what would his actions have been? We didn't declare war really against Germany. We were dragged into it as a reaction, not as an action, as I see it.
There's a new book out called FDR and the Jews by Richard Breitman and Richard Lichtheim, which sort of divides Roosevelt into four periods. 1933 to 1937 or 38, their argument is he was consumed with the Depression and had neither the time, the energy, or the ability to influence events in Nazi Germany. I'm not asking you to accept it. I'm saying this is the argument. These are two pretty good historians. They give him fairly good marks for the period roughly coinciding with Kristallnacht to the outbreak to American entry, to the outbreak of war in Europe. And they point out that, for example, after Kristallnacht occurred, he gave a press conference where he said he was shocked. He could not believe that such things could happen in a civilized country. He said that the tens of thousands of Austrian and German Jews who were in the United States on visitors' visas, which had a finite date, would be allowed to stay because I cannot, in good conscience, throw them out. He even promoted plans to get other countries to take in Jews. Then, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, you're absolutely right. The United States would not have sent soldiers to Europe if it had not. I don't know whether the United States would have entered the war without the attack on Pearl Harbor. There's no question in my mind that if Hitler had won in Europe and defeated the Soviet Union, sooner or later, he would have attacked the United States. He said that in multiple meetings. We will deal with this Jewish democracy, these Jews of the dollar, and we will exterminate them. There isn't any question in my mind. So I think sooner or later the United States would have been fighting. But I don't think the United States would have gone to war simply to save the Jews. But that's no different than what's occurred in Cambodia, Bosnia, and all these other places. So yeah, you know, this is what the debate is about. And in my view, I can't say that you're without a foundation for what you're saying, for the exasperation. But it's a debate that I think is going to go on until the end of time.
I want to go back that I think the conformance view is more than just the Groden people, because there was a Polish spy who came to America and spoke to FDR and said about the Holocaust. And FDR told Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, is this true or not? Frankfurter, I don't think he did that much research, said, I can't believe it's not true. And if you look at Supreme Court Frankfurter, he was a conformist. And we can also go back with the State Department. The U.S. also sent Japanese to internment camps. So it wasn't just the State Department, it was very anti-Semitic.
There's no question that Roosevelt knew by December of 1942 of the exterminations. He issued a war crimes declaration that said that was taking place. But the episode you're talking about involved a member of the Polish underground, not the Jewish underground, the Polish underground. The individual's name was Jan Karski. He made his way out of Poland after first having infiltrated the Warsaw Ghetto and then a concentration camp. And this is one extraordinary story. He gets to Britain, then he crosses to the United States. He's taken, the Polish ambassador from the Polish government in exile sets up a series of dinners, including with State Department officials and with Frankfurter, leading up to a meeting with Roosevelt. Take this story for what it is, what you will. Frankfurter at his dinner says to Jan Karski, Mr. Karski, I hear a great deal about what is happening to the Jews. I hear awful things. Tell me what is going on. Karski proceeds to do just that. After listening to Karski, who apparently didn't hold back what he had seen, Frankfurter gets up, paces around the room, then turns to Karski and to the Polish ambassador, Felix Ciechanowski, and says, I must tell you, Mr. Ambassador, I cannot believe him. The ambassador gets up, shocked. Felix, how can you, it was John Ciechanowski, I think. It was Felix Felix, how, to Frankfurter, how can you say that? The authority of my government is behind him. Frankfurter says, I did not say he is lying. I said I cannot believe him. There is a difference. And then he gets up and walks away. One interpretation is that it was just a cute dodge for him not to do anything. But another interpretation is, and I think this is probably closer to the truth, is that here you have this epitome of civilization, a Supreme Court justice, a great Supreme Court justice. He's used to reason and logic. And he listens to the story of the Warsaw Ghetto and the concentration camp, and he can't handle it. He says to himself, I can't believe this is taking place. And the truth is, for me, is I'm working on this stuff. We all know what we know. And every now and then I would look up and say to the wall, say to no one in particular, I can't believe this happened. And I think an important part of the American response was that people just could not believe that such a thing was taking place.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. A great audience.